The first time Lucy Chandler heard the name Monroe Mercer, she was standing in the dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and the man behind the counter went pale as a sheet just saying it. She had arrived in Caldwell 3 days prior on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, carrying one trunk, a worn leather satchel, and a letter from the Caldwell Land Office confirming that her late father's homestead claim of 160 acres sat 6 miles east of town. The letter had taken 4 months to reach her in St. Louis, and by the time she had settled her father's small debts and said goodbye to the boarding house where she had lived for the last 2 years teaching piano lessons to merchants' daughters, there was almost nothing left of Thomas Chandler's savings except the land itself. The land, and whatever promise it held. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of a kind of quiet resolve that people sometimes mistook for coldness until they saw her eyes, which were the warm brown of creek water catching afternoon sun. She had not come to Kansas looking for a husband or a rescue or a story. She had come because the land was hers, because her father had believed in it before the consumption took him, and because she had nowhere else that truly belonged to her. "Mercer's land," said the store clerk, a young man named Holt with a considerable Adam's apple, when she mentioned that she was going to be settling east of town. "Your land is right next to Mercer's spread." "Is that a problem?" Lucy asked, setting her list of supplies on the counter. Holt scratched the back of his neck. "Depends on your definition of problem. Miss Monroe Mercer runs the biggest cattle operation in the Sumner County Valley. 7,000 head, last count. He's been ranching that land since before the town had a bank. He's rough as cut sandstone and about as talkative as one too. Some folks say he ran off the last 3 homesteaders who tried to settle the parcel east of his fence line." He paused. "Nothing proven, mind you, but nothing disproven either." Lucy looked at him steadily. "I see. And what is on my father's claim?" "A creek, some grassland, a falling down soddy, and a lot of hope," Holt said, not unkindly. "Then I suppose hope is where I will start," she said. And she set about ordering flour, salt pork, lard, cornmeal, coffee, and the other essentials of a first Kansas spring. She hired a wagon from the livery and drove herself out to the claim the following morning, the prairie wind pushing at her bonnet, and the great flat sky above Caldwell stretching in every direction like something that wanted to make a person feel small. It very nearly worked. But Lucy had grown up watching her father read maps of the territory with the kind of reverence other men reserved for scripture, and she had inherited something of that same stubborn love for open country. She let the prairie make her feel small, and then she sat up straighter on the wagon seat and kept driving. The soddy was in worse condition than the letter had suggested, which was saying something since the letter had not been optimistic. One wall had partially collapsed inward, and the roof, such as it was, had a hole above the eastern corner large enough to let in both the weather and the stars. The creek, however, was beautiful. It ran clear and cold along the southern edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees that were just now pushing out their first pale leaves, and the grassland beyond the creek showed the deep, rich green of ground that had not been overgrazed. Lucy walked the entire claim that first afternoon, boots collecting red Kansas mud, and by the time she returned to the wagon, she had made herself a list of what needed doing in order of urgency. She had been on the property for 4 days, sleeping in the wagon with a canvas strung over it for weather, when Monroe Mercer rode onto her land. She heard the horse first, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a large animal being ridden by someone in no hurry, someone who was used to the land making way for him rather than the other way around. She was carrying water from the creek in a pair of tin buckets, and she straightened up and turned around. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not tall in the wiry way of many ranch hands, but built with the kind of density that comes from decades of actual labor, broad across the shoulders, his hands on the reins like a man who had been holding reins since before he could properly read. He rode a bay horse, dark as mahogany, and he wore a battered brown hat pulled low against the morning sun, and a canvas duster that had seen considerable weather. His face, what she could see of it, was tanned to deep copper, heavily lined around the eyes, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same country he ranched. He might have been 38 or 45. It was genuinely hard to say. The sun and the work and the years had settled into him in a way that made conventional age irrelevant. He stopped his horse at 10 feet and looked down at her from the saddle, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Monroe Mercer reached up and took his hat off. He held it against his chest, that great worn hat with its sweat-darkened band, and he looked at her directly, and his expression was not the dismissive appraisal she had half expected. It was something more careful than that. Something almost formal. "Miss," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned a long time ago it didn't need to be loud to carry weight. "I'm Monroe Mercer. I run the double M operation on the land west of your fence line." Lucy set down her buckets. "I know who you are, Mr. Mercer. I'm Lucy Chandler. This is my father's claim." "Was your father's claim?" he said, not cruelly, just precisely. "Thomas Chandler. I heard he passed this past winter." "He did." "I'm sorry for your loss." He said it flatly, the way men in that country said things they meant but didn't know how to ornament. "I wanted to come introduce myself and let you know that if you have any difficulty with the property lines, my foreman Webb can walk the boundary with you." It was not what she had expected. She had expected a man who came to run her off, not one who came to offer neighborly assistance with the surveying. She studied him for a moment with the directness she had that sometimes unsettled people. "Mr. Mercer, I have heard from at least 2 people in town that you are responsible for 3 prior homesteaders leaving this property." He was quiet for what felt like a full 10 seconds. The bay horse shifted its weight. "I heard that too," Monroe said finally. "The first 2 left because the land is hard, and the winter is harder, and they were not prepared for either one. The third one, a fellow named Prout, he left because he was running stolen cattle through this creek bed, and I told him I'd be letting the Sumner County Sheriff know if he stayed. He left of his own accord." He paused. "That is the truth of it. You can believe it or not as you choose." Lucy looked at him. He looked back at her with that same careful steadiness, hat still held against his chest, the wind moving the prairie grass around his horse's legs. "I believe you," she said, because she did, and because she had always found that starting from a position of reasonable trust was more productive than suspicion. "I appreciate the introduction, Mr. Mercer." He gave a single nod, set his hat back on his head, and turned the bay horse back toward the west without another word. She watched him go, and she noticed something that stayed with her through the rest of that long working day. He was the only man she'd encountered since arriving in Caldwell who had taken his hat off when she spoke to him. Every other man, from the land agent to the store clerk to the wagon driver from the livery, had kept their hats on, tipping them at most in brief acknowledgement, the way you might nod at furniture. Monroe Mercer had held his hat against his chest for the entire duration of their conversation, as though she were someone worth the full attention of a person's posture. She filed that away. She was not sure yet what to make of Monroe Mercer, but she was fairly certain he was not what people in town believed him to be. The month of May in Caldwell in 1878 was a relentless teacher. Lucy discovered that the soddy could not be salvaged and would need to be rebuilt from scratch or replaced with a proper frame structure, which she could not yet afford. She discovered that the grassland, beautiful as it was, contained a stretch of alkali soil along its northern edge that would need careful management before it could support a kitchen garden. She discovered that the creek, while beautiful and clear, ran shallower than she'd hoped in dry weather, and she would need to consider how to store water through the dry months of July and August. She also discovered that she was lonelier than she had anticipated. She was not a woman who complained about solitude. She had spent 2 years in a St. Louis boarding house sharing walls and meals and air with a dozen other women, and had found it pleasant enough but not sustaining in any deep way. She had expected to find the Kansas prairie restorative by comparison, and in many ways she did. The silence of it, the enormous quiet of the grassland under that impossible sky, fed something in her that city life had starved. But there was a difference, she was learning, between solitude that was chosen and solitude that was imposed by circumstance, and she was not yet sure which kind she had. The nearest female neighbor was a farmer's wife named Etta Sorensen, who lived 4 miles north, and came to call on Lucy's third week, bringing a pan of corn bread and enough practical information about Kansas weather to fill a small almanac. Etta was stout and cheerful and Lutheran, and had 7 children and absolutely no patience for pretense of any kind, and Lucy liked her enormously immediately. They fell into the habit of visiting once a week, alternating whose property they met on, and those visits became the steady rhythm around which Lucy organized the rest of her time. In town, she was learning the social geography of Caldwell. It was a cattle town, sitting at the end of the Kisham Trail, and in the spring and summer it filled with drovers coming up from Texas with longhorn herds, which meant it also filled with a particular kind of noise and conflict that the resident population had developed elaborate strategies for managing. There was a law office, a courthouse, a land office, a doctor who was competent on his sober days, 2 churches, 4 saloons, and a school that was perpetually in need of a teacher. It was the school that presented Lucy with her first real opportunity. She went to see the school board chairman, a dry goods merchant named Aldred Poole, in the second week of May, and by the end of the meeting she had agreed to teach the Caldwell schoolhouse through the summer session at $17 a month, which was not wealth, but it was the difference between surviving her first Kansas year and not. She rode too, and from school each day on a plain brown mare she had bought from the livery for $12 and named Patience, which seemed apt. The ride was 6 miles each way, and she used the time to think about the land and what to do with it, and sometimes she passed the boundary of the double M and could see, in the far distance, the movement of cattle or the figures of riders going about the work of a large ranching operation. She had not spoken to Monroe Mercer again since that first morning. She was coming home from school on a Thursday in the third week of May when Patience threw a shoe on the rutted creek road, and Lucy was walking the mare the last mile toward her claim when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her, and turned to find Monroe Mercer and a younger hand she didn't know coming up the road from the direction of town. He saw her immediately and turned his horse toward her. The younger hand followed. Monroe pulled up beside her and took his hat off in a single smooth motion, holding it against his chest with that same formality she had noticed the first time. "Miss Chandler, your mare go lame." "She threw a shoe," Lucy said, continuing to walk. She was tired and her boots were rubbing and she was not in the mood to stand still and be looked down at from a saddle. "I'm walking her in." Monroe looked at the mare's foot and then back at her. "You're 1.5 miles from your place. Creek Road's got rocks that'll cut her frog if you walk her on it." "I know," Lucy said, because she did know and she was already frustrated about it. "I'm staying to the grass edge." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he swung down from the bay horse with the ease of a man who had been getting on and off horses for so long it was simply a form of breathing. He handed his reins to the younger hand without looking at him. "Jake, take Sable back to the double M and tell Webb I'll be along." The young hand named Jake looked briefly uncertain, the way young hands do when their boss does something unexpected, and then nodded and turned both horses and rode back the way they'd come. Monroe walked beside Lucy, and Patience, as if recognizing that something had shifted, settled into a calmer pace. "You don't have to walk with me," Lucy said. "The road's easier with 2 people watching for rocks," he said simply. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the road ahead. "You could have just told me to stay to the grass," she said. "Told you that already." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "So you did." They walked in silence for a while, which was, Lucy thought, a more comfortable silence than she would have predicted given that she barely knew this man. The late afternoon light was doing extraordinary things to the Kansas prairie, turning the grass from green to gold, throwing long shadows from the cottonwoods along the creek, and the sky overhead was beginning to pull up the first pale colors of what would be a spectacular sunset. "How is the claim coming?" Monroe asked after a while. "Slowly," Lucy said. "The soddy needs to come down and something needs to go up in its place. I've been looking into the cost of lumber." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a sawmill out of Wichita that does a fair price on board lumber if you order quantity. My foreman Webb can tell you the man to contact." "Thank you," she said, and then, because she had always believed in directness, "Why are you being helpful?" Monroe glanced at her, and she caught the expression on his face before he put the neutral look back in place. There was something in those eyes, dark gray like a weather front coming in, that was more complex than the broad, silent exterior suggested. "You're my neighbor," he said. "You've had neighbors before and run them off if the town gossip is to be believed." "The town gossip is a creative institution," he said dryly. "I told you the truth of those situations already." "You did," she acknowledged. "I'm asking why you're being helpful specifically." He looked at the road ahead again and was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because you're here to work the land, not pass through it. A person can tell the difference." It was not a flattering speech. It was not designed to charm her or put color in her cheeks. It was simply an honest statement of observation, and she found it more interesting than flattery would have been. They reached her claim as the sun was beginning its final descent. Monroe walked with her to the small paddock she had put together from salvaged fence posts and new wire where patients would be kept overnight, and he checked the mare's hoof with practiced efficiency, confirming the shoe was cleanly lost with no damage to the foot underneath. "She'll be fine," he said. "If you ride to the Caldwell livery tomorrow morning, Hatch the smithy can fit her right." "Thank you," Lucy said. She looked at him in the evening light. "Will you come in for coffee?" "I have no proper house to offer, but I can make coffee on the camp stove." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that the invitation surprised him more than he intended to show. "I'll take you up on that," he said. She made coffee over the small iron camp stove she had set up under the canvas lean, to she used as a working space beside the ruined soddy. Monroe sat on an overturned crate and drank the coffee black and looked at the remains of the soddy with the assessing eye of a man who had built things and torn them down and built them again. "I'll have it cleared by the end of the month," Lucy said, following his gaze. "I need a proper foundation before the summer heat hits." "The southeast corner of your lot," Monroe said, tilting his head toward the creek. "You've got a natural windbreak from those cottonwoods and a slight rise in the ground that'll keep water from running under the floor. That's where I'd build." Lucy looked. He was right. She could see that immediately. She had been so focused on the central portion of the claim near the old soddy that she had not properly assessed the eastern edge near the trees. "You know this land," she said. "I've been looking at it from the other side of the fence line for 11 years, he said. "There's not much about the valley I don't know." She poured more coffee into his cup without asking, and he accepted it without comment, and they sat in the quiet of the Kansas evening while the sky turned from orange to purple to the deep, soft dark of a prairie night coming on, and the first stars appeared overhead, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a mockingbird started up its repertoire of borrowed songs. Monroe Mercer set down his cup and stood up, settling his hat on his head. "Good evening, Miss Chandler," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer." He walked to where he'd tied his horse at the fence post, mounted with that easy economy of motion, and rode west in the growing dark. Lucy watched him go and thought that Monroe Mercer was either the most straightforward man she had ever met or the most complicated, and she was not yet sure which, and she found that she was more interested in finding out than she had expected to be. June came in on a wave of heat that rolled across the Kansas plains and flattened everything before it. The schoolhouse became a furnace by mid-morning, and Lucy learned very quickly to do her most complex teaching in the early hours and shift, to rote recitation and reading aloud in the afternoon when the air inside the building was thick enough to cut. She had 18 students, ranging from 6-year-old Bess Sorensen, Edda's youngest, to a 15-year-old boy named Cal Poole who had decided midway through the spring term that school was beneath his dignity, and spent most of his time in the back row carving things into the underside of his desk. She handled Cal Poole the way she handled most problems, which was directly and without drama. She put him in charge of teaching the younger students their multiplication tables, which turned out to be the exact right move, because it turned out that Cal Poole had a genuine gift for explaining things he already understood, and a barely concealed desire to be seen as competent. Within 2 weeks he had become her most reliable assistant, and the carving had stopped. The lumber for the house frame was ordered in the second week of June, through the contact Monroe's foreman Webb had provided, and arranged to arrive at the end of the month. While she waited for it, Lucy spent her non-school hours clearing the ruined soddy and hauling its salvageable material to the creek bank, and preparing the southeast site Monroe had identified. She was not too proud to acknowledge when someone gave her good advice. Webb, Monroe's foreman, came by twice during those weeks, once to help her locate the correct property markers, and once to drop off a coil of extra fence wire that Monroe had apparently sent without any note or explanation. Webb was a long-faced, quietly competent man from Missouri who had worked the Double M for 8 years and treated Lucy with a courteous neutrality that she suspected was partly his own manner and partly instructions from Monroe. Monroe himself appeared on a Saturday morning in the middle of June, riding up to the southeast corner of her claim, where she was staking out the foundation measurements with a string line and a pointed stick. She heard the horse and turned, and he pulled up and took his hat off, holding it against his chest in that way of his that she was beginning to understand was entirely unconscious, a gesture of respect so deeply habitual that he probably didn't know he did it. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She looked at the hat in his hands and felt something move in her chest that she set firmly aside. "I'm laying out the foundation. Your suggestion about the southeast corner was right. The ground sits 3 inches higher than anywhere else on the flat." He looked at her string lines with an expression of assessment. "You're going to want to square that back corner. The northeast stake is about 2 inches off." She looked at her measurements and saw that he was right. She felt a brief flare of irritation at herself for the error, moved the stake the necessary distance, and felt the irritation pass. "Thank you," she said. "Would you like to be useful?" He looked briefly startled by the directness of it, and then something in his face that was almost amusement settled into place. He swung down from the bay horse. "I expect I can manage that," he said. They spent the morning squaring out the foundation together, Monroe holding the measuring line while Lucy drove stakes, both of them working with an ease that surprised her. He was not a man who talked constantly while he worked, which suited her fine because she wasn't either. But when he said something, it was always useful, a slight adjustment to the orientation to better account for the prevailing wind, a suggestion about the depth of the corner posts to handle the Kansas freeze-and-thaw cycle, a note about which local stone to look for if she wanted to dry stack a foundation wall that would last. He knew how to build things. He knew how to build them to last. They ate their noon meal sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek, Lucy having produced a modest spread of bread and cold salt pork and dried apple from her supply boxes, and Monroe eating with the direct appetite of a man who didn't think much about the social performance of meals. She poured water from the creek, which was cold and clean, and they sat with the sound of the water running beside them and the heat of the Kansas noon pressing down on the open grassland beyond the trees. "How did you come to have the Double M?" she asked. 11 years is a long time." Monroe looked at the creek. "Came west from Missouri in '67. I was 29. I had $400 and a mule and a specific intention not to go back east." He paused. "The land was homestead claim then. I filed on it, built a 1-room house, and spent the first 3 years convincing myself I hadn't made a catastrophic error." "And did you make a catastrophic error?" "No," he said simply. "Hardest years of my life, but the land is good and I understood cattle and I stayed with it." He was quiet for a moment. "I bought the neighboring claim in '71, when the man who filed on it couldn't make the improvements required by the law. Added another section in '74. Now it's 7,000 head and 12 hands and more fence line than I sometimes care to count. And no family," she asked, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped. In a more formal social setting she would not have asked it so plainly, but something about the way Monroe talked, or rather the way he didn't talk unnecessarily, made plainness feel like the only appropriate currency. He looked at the water for a moment. "My wife died in 1872. Fever, in July." He said it with the flat steadiness of someone who has learned to hold grief in a form they can carry without it undoing them. "We had no children." "I'm sorry," Lucy said. He looked at her then, and something crossed his face that was neither sorrow nor its absence, but something more like the acknowledgement of a country he had traveled through and come out the other side of. "It was a long time ago." She nodded. She understood, in the way of people who have had their own losses, that length of time was not the same as lightness of grief. But she also understood that some people needed their griefs to be acknowledged and moved past rather than dwelt in, and Monroe Mercer seemed to be that kind of person. "My father believed in this land," she said, looking at the creek running over its smooth stones. "He filed the claim in '76 and got sick before he could come out to work it. He died in January." She paused. "He used to say that the territory was the last place in America where a person could still decide what kind of life they were going to make without the weight of every decision that had already been made for them." Monroe was quiet, listening. "I think he was right," Lucy said. "I think I needed to find that out for myself." Monroe looked at her for a long moment, that careful, assessing look that she was getting used to. "You're going to make something of this place," he said, not as a compliment, not as encouragement. As an assessment, the same way he'd assess the foundation stakes, looking at the evidence and drawing a conclusion. She felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the Kansas heat. "Yes," she said, "I am." The lumber arrived on the 28th of June, 14 wagons of it from the Wichita sawmill, and Monroe showed up on the 1st of July with his full crew of 12 hands, and a matter-of-fact announcement that they were going to spend the day helping her frame the house before the summer work of moving cattle to higher pasture required his men's attention elsewhere. Lucy stood at the edge of her cleared building site and looked at 12 sunburned cowboys who had apparently been informed by their employer that they were spending their Saturday building a neighbor's house frame, and she was so thoroughly undone by this that she almost said something that would have embarrassed her. She controlled herself. "Thank you," she said to Monroe, who was standing beside her with his hat off in its customary position against his chest. "I'll feed everyone dinner." "You don't need to do that," he said. "I want to," she said firmly. "It's the right thing to do." He looked at her and nodded once. "All right." The double M hands were efficient and experienced, and they worked the way men do when they have done hard labor together for years, with a minimum of conversation and a maximum of coordinated effort. By noon, the corner posts were in, and the first wall frames were going up, and Lucy fed everyone cornbread and beans and coffee, and a dried apple pie she had started the night before, and the hands ate with the same direct, uncomplicated appetite as their employer. Monroe worked beside his men all day, not directing from a distance but physically present, lifting beams, driving nails, measuring and checking and correcting. He had taken off his duster and his hat, and Lucy, who was moving between cooking and fetching water and helping where she could, found her attention returning to him at intervals throughout the day in a way she was not entirely comfortable with. He was 40 years old, she had calculated by then. 16 years older than her. That was a considerable gap, and she was not the kind of woman to ignore considerable gaps in favor of more immediately interesting feelings. She filed the feeling carefully away and kept working. By the time the summer light began to lengthen toward evening, the house frame was standing, 4 walls, a roof beam, and the beginning of a floor structure. It was not finished. It would take her weeks more to get it to a livable state, hiring what local help she could afford, doing what she could herself. But it was standing, and it was real, and she stood in what would be her front doorway and looked out at the Kansas evening and felt something that was not quite happiness but was in the same county. Monroe came to stand beside her in the doorway. His men had ridden back to the Double M, boots dusty and backs tired, with the easy satisfaction of people who have done a day's good work. He had stayed to check the corner joints one more time. "It's a solid frame," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer, truly." He looked at the doorway, at the frame above them, and then at her. He had his hat in his hand. "Monroe," he said. She looked at him. "My name," he said. "If you're going to thank me, you might as well use it." The warmth in her chest this time was considerably more direct, and she let herself acknowledge it, at least privately. "Monroe," she said. "Thank you." "Lucy," he said. Just that, just her name, as if he was trying it out to see if it fit the shape of what he meant by it. The mockingbird started up in the cottonwoods again. They stood there in the frame of what would become her house in the last light of a Kansas summer day, and neither of them moved for a moment. And the prairie wind moved the tall grass, and the sky above Caldwell turned every shade of gold a sky can manage. And Lucy thought with sudden and precise clarity that this was a significant moment in her life, and that she would remember it. Then Monroe put his hat back on, nodded to her, and walked to his horse, and she watched him ride west in the dusk, and she went inside her canvas lean-to and sat down on her supply crate and decided she was going to have to be very careful with herself, because Monroe Mercer was not a man you could feel things about carelessly. July was the hardest month. The heat was extraordinary, the kind of heat that makes the air itself visible, that turns the horizon into a shimmer and drains the color from the sky. Lucy taught school in the mornings and worked on her house in the late afternoons when the worst of the heat had peaked, and the shade of the cottonwoods made the sight bearable. She had hired a local carpenter named Dutch Hennessy for 3 days a week to help with the interior work. A small, meticulous man who had once been a furniture maker in Pennsylvania, and now turned his precision to whatever building work Caldwell offered. Dutch was pleasant company and skilled beyond his daily rate, and with his help the house began to take shape from the inside. Plank floors, a proper loft, a stone chimney and fireplace on the south wall built from the creek stones Monroe had directed her to. It was a simple house by any standard, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft, but it was well made and it was hers. And the day she moved out of the canvas lean-to and into the main room with her trunk and her satchel and her small collection of books was one of the better days of her life. Etta Sorensen came and brought curtain fabric and spent an afternoon helping Lucy hang them, and Etta's 2 oldest daughters came along and were put to work scrubbing floors, and by evening the little house on the creek had the smell of soap and cedar, and something that was very close to home. Monroe came by twice during July. Once on a weekday morning when he was riding the boundary, and stopped to look at the construction progress with what she was learning to recognize as his version of approval, which was a single nod and the absence of comment, meaning there was nothing wrong. The second time was on a Sunday afternoon when he brought 2 things. A cast iron pot that he said had been unused in the Double M cookhouse for years, which he delivered with such a practiced air of casual indifference to the value of the gesture that she had to look at the wall for a moment to compose herself, and a question. The question was this: there was to be an Independence Day gathering at the Sorensen farm on the 15th of July, delayed from the actual date due to Olaf Sorensen's schedule, and the Valley families were all invited, and would she be attending? "I think so," Lucy said, looking at the cast iron pot, which was beautiful and exactly what she needed. Etta mentioned it. Monroe turned his hat in his hands in a way she had not seen him do before, slowly, like a man who was thinking about something more than he was saying. "I intend to go myself," he said. "If you haven't arranged a way out there, I could bring you in the wagon." Lucy looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, careful attention she had come to think of as characteristic. No performance to it, no charm offensive, just a direct question from a direct man. "I would like that," she said. Something in his face settled almost imperceptibly, the way a horse does when it stops being uncertain about its footing. "I'll come at 10, he said. The Sorensen gathering was everything a Kansas Valley social occasion was in those years. Tables set up under the open sky, women who had spent days on the food they brought, men who had spent the same days pretending they weren't looking forward to a day off, children running in directions that made their mothers tired just watching. There was a fiddle and a harmonica, and eventually a caller who organized a Virginia reel that half the valley participated in with varying degrees of skill and entirely equal degrees of enthusiasm. Monroe arrived at Lucy's place at 10 sharp in a wagon that he had clearly cleaned, and that he was driving with his good hat on. Not the battered everyday one, but a dark brown hat with a cleaner line that she had not seen before. He helped her up to the wagon seat with a hand that was steady and warm, and immediately removed once she was settled. And he drove the 6 miles to the Sorensen farm with the quiet ease of a man comfortable in his own company, which she had come to appreciate considerably. At the gathering, she discovered several things about Monroe Mercer that she had not known. She discovered that he was known in the valley as a fair man in business, that the cattlemen who competed with him respected him even when they were frustrated by him, that he had donated the land for the Second Caldwell Church without making a public announcement about it, and that he apparently gave work to men who could not find it elsewhere when he had any room for them on the Double M. She also discovered that the valley's women regarded Monroe Mercer with a complicated mixture of respect and frustrated bewilderment, because he was by any objective measure a substantial catch, and he had spent 6 years showing not the faintest sign of interest in being caught. "He doesn't come to these things usually," Etta Sorensen said quietly to Lucy while they were setting out the food together. Etta's eyes were moving between Lucy and Monroe with the expression of a woman who has done enough arithmetic to have arrived at a conclusion. Last 3 Independence gatherings he sent his regrets. "Perhaps he was busy," Lucy said, arranging sliced bread on a board. Etta made a sound that communicated extensive skepticism without any specific words. Monroe, for his part, stayed near the periphery of the social activity for most of the gathering, talking to the cattlemen and a few of the homesteaders, eating when the food was served, not making himself the center of anything but not being antisocial either. He danced the Virginia reel because the caller essentially conscripted him, and he accepted it with the same matter-of-fact compliance that he seemed to apply to most things that were asked of him. He danced well. She noticed this. The fiddle music ran bright and fast, and he moved through the figures with an ease that suggested he had danced before, in another time, in another life, and the knowledge was still in his body even if the context for it was gone. When the reel ended and the dancing reformed into a slower, more conversational pattern, he made his way through the crowd and stood beside her where she was sitting on a bench near the tables. He took his hat off and held it. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "Very much," she said. "Are you?" He considered this with his customary seriousness. "More than I expected," he said. She smiled at that, and she felt him look at her when she smiled in a way that made her want to keep smiling just to see what happened to his expression when she did. "Dance with me," she said. He looked at her. "I'm told I'm a reasonable partner," she added, "and the music is good." "It is," he agreed, and he put his hat down on the bench beside her and offered his hand. They danced twice, slow, careful turns in the Kansas afternoon, and Monroe Mercer's hand at her waist was exactly as steady and certain as she had expected it to be, and he watched her face while they danced with a focused attention that made her feel the way she imagined the prairie grass felt under that impossible sky. Seen, very completely seen. On the wagon ride home, in the long gold light of the early evening, they were quiet together the way they had been learning to be quiet, which was to say comfortably, with occasional words that emerged naturally from the silence rather than filling it up out of social obligation. "My wife loved dancing," Monroe said, somewhere in the middle of the 3rd mile, Lucy looked at him. He was watching the road, his hands easy on the reins. "She sounds like she was a good woman," Lucy said. "She was," he said. "She deserved better than what the territory offered her, and she never said so once." They were quiet again. "What was her name?" Lucy asked. "Ruth," he said. She let the name sit in the air between them for a moment, let it have its proper weight, and then she said, "She must have loved this land too if she stayed." Monroe glanced at her, and something in his face shifted in a way she was getting better at reading. He was surprised by the observation, moved by it slightly. "She did," he said. "She really did." The wagon rolled on through the evening, and a coyote called somewhere north of the creek road, and the sky over Caldwell began its nightly performance of extraordinary color, and Lucy thought that this man beside her was the most genuinely interesting person she had met in a very long time, and she was no longer making much effort to set that feeling aside. August brought a different kind of trouble. There was a man named Dewey Sloan who had been running a modest cattle operation east of Caldwell, and he had a claim that abutted Lucy's northeastern corner. She had not had much interaction with him, a brief introduction at the Sorensen gathering, during which she had registered that he was loud, self-congratulatory, and watched her in a way that she didn't care for. She had filed him under unpleasant but irrelevant and moved on. In the second week of August, Sloan began running his cattle across the northeastern corner of her property, past her fence line and into the grassland near the creek. The first time it happened, she assumed it was an accident and rode to his operation to tell him. He received her with a show of exaggerated apology that she did not believe for a moment, and the cattle were moved. The second time, 3 days later, she rode over again. This time Sloan was less apologetic and more expansive in his explanation of why her fence line was probably not where she thought it was, based on his own very certain reading of the survey. And if she looked at it from his perspective, she would see that the grassland near the creek was really the kind of thing that could be argued either way. "It cannot be argued either way," Lucy said flatly. "I have the land office survey. The boundary is marked. Your cattle are on my land." Sloan smiled at her in a way that made her want to smack him with something heavy. "Now, Miss Chandler, there's no need to be difficult. These things have a way of working themselves out between neighbors if people are reasonable about them." "I am being reasonable," she said. "I am asking you to keep your cattle on your side of the fence line. If you cannot do that, I will take the matter to the county office." She left before he could say anything else. She did not tell Monroe about it immediately, partly because it felt like her problem to handle, and partly because she was uncertain what she wanted from him in relation to it. She was not looking for someone to solve her difficulties. She had been solving her own difficulties all her life. But when Sloan's cattle came through a third time, and this time made it all the way to the creek, drinking in water that Lucy needed for her own purposes and turning up the bank with their hooves, she was genuinely angry. And when Monroe appeared at her fence line on his usual Sunday ride-by and saw the hoof damage along the creek bank, he pulled up his horse and looked at her with a direct question in his face. She told him. Monroe's expression during her account of events was entirely still, which she had learned was the equivalent of considerable emotion in a less contained man. "Sloan," he said when she finished. "He's a bully," she said. "And he thinks a woman on her own won't push back hard enough to make the problem worth avoiding." "He's wrong about that," Monroe said, and the dry, certain way he said it made her want to kiss him, a thought she immediately found alarming enough to set very firmly aside. "I know that," she said. "I intend to go to the county office this week." "Do that," Monroe said, "and I will speak to Sloan." "You don't need to fight my battles," she said. "I'm not fighting your battle," he said. "Sloan's cattle have been eyeing my southwest pasture fence for 2 months. I have my own things to say to him." This was said with such calm precision that she believed it entirely. "All right," she said. Whatever Monroe said to Dewey Sloan, she never learned the specifics of, and she did not ask. She went to the county office in Caldwell the following Monday and filed a formal complaint with the supporting survey documents, and a county official came out to walk the boundary with her by the end of the week. Sloane's cattle did not appear on her land again. Sloane himself, when she occasionally saw him in town, gave her a wide berth with an expression that suggested considerable unwillingness to meet her eye. She mentioned this to Monroe on his next visit, and he listened to the update and nodded once with the kind of satisfaction a person takes in a just outcome, and then said, "Good," and that was the end of it. She looked at him and said, on an impulse she decided to honor, "Would you like to stay for supper?" He looked at her for a moment with those gray storm-front eyes. "Yes," he said. It was the first time he had been inside her house. She had gotten the interior sorted through August, the furniture mostly second-hand from the Caldwell dry goods store, a table and 2 chairs, and a proper cast-iron stove that she had saved for through July's school salary. Her books arranged on the shelf she'd had Dutch Hennessy build beside the fireplace. The curtains Etta had helped her hang moving in the evening breeze through the open window. Monroe sat at her table and looked at the books on the shelf with the attention he gave to things he was genuinely interested in. "You've read all of those?" he asked. "Most of them twice," she said, turning the stove up and setting a pan on it. "Is that unusual?" "Not unusual," he said. "Rare, maybe." He looked at the titles: a volume of Emerson, a worn copy of David Copperfield, a collection of botanical illustrations, a practical manual of homestead farming, a book of Kansas geography. "You have an interesting mind." It was not said as a compliment in the conventional sense. It was said as an observation, the same way he said everything, looking at the evidence and noting what it contained. But it settled into her as warmly as any compliment she had ever received. She made a simple supper of roast pork and potatoes, and the last of a jar of pickled green beans Etta had given her, and Monroe ate it with quiet appreciation, and told her that the pickles were the best thing he had eaten since a cook he had employed briefly in '75 who had left for San Francisco. They talked for 2 hours over supper and after it. She discovered that he had read more than she would have expected, that he had strong opinions about land management and cattle breeding and the future of the Kansas grasslands, opinions that were ecologically sophisticated in a way that surprised her, until she realized they came from 11 years of watching land respond to how it was used. She told him about St. Louis and the boarding house and the piano lessons and the slow, grinding grief of her father's illness, and he listened to all of it with the same focused, respectful attention that he brought to everything she said. When he stood up to go, standing in her doorway with the September darkness behind him and the stars enormous overhead, he looked at her with something in his expression that was so carefully held in place that she understood it was being held carefully on purpose, and she felt the same thing in herself, the same careful holding. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," he said. He put his hat on. He stood there for a moment longer than leaving required. Then he said, "Good night, Lucy." "Good night, Monroe." He walked to his horse and she stood in her doorway watching him, and when he had gone, she sat down at her table and put both hands flat on the surface and made herself be honest with herself about what was happening, because she had always found honesty with herself more useful than its alternative. She was falling in love with Monroe Mercer. She was doing it the way water finds its level in the ground, not dramatically, not with any theatrical sudden recognition, but steadily and inevitably, following the path that the shape of things created. He was a man of genuine integrity and unusual depth and considerable solitude, and she was a woman who had been looking all her life for a landscape large enough to live in, and it appeared that the landscape in question was not just the Kansas prairie. She was not yet sure what to do about this. In the first week of September, Monroe did not come to her property, and she told herself this was because the fall cattle work was pressing, which she knew from Etta to be true, as September was when the Double M moved its herd to the lower winter pastures, and the work was constant and consuming. But there were a few days in the middle of that week when she looked west toward the Double M fence line and felt the absence of something in a way that was entirely new information about the state of her own feelings. She went to school. She taught her students long division and American history, and the names of the planets and the proper way to write a formal letter. She came home and worked on the kitchen garden. She was putting in along the south side of the house, late in the season, but productive enough for what would survive into fall. She visited Etta on Thursday and listened to Etta talk about her children and her husband and the eternal negotiation of a marriage, and she found herself listening differently than she had before, with an attention that was partly about Etta and partly about something she was trying to understand more generally. "Tell me about marriage," she said to Etta, with a directness that made Etta look up from the bread she was kneading with a somewhat startled expression. "That's a large subject," Etta said. "Pick the most important part," Lucy said. Etta worked the bread in silence for a moment. "The most important part," she said finally, "is whether you respect each other enough to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Everything else you can figure out as you go. But if the truth doesn't fit between you, nothing else will either." Lucy thought about this for the rest of the week. Monroe appeared at her fence on Saturday morning, looking tired in the way of a man who has been working without sufficient sleep for 2 weeks, and he sat on his horse and looked at the creek and the house and the kitchen garden, and then he took his hat off and held it and looked at her where she was standing at the fence line. "The fall work is done," he said. "I know," she said. "Etta told me the Double M crews have been riding since before dawn every day." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was more open than his usual careful neutrality, fatigue having apparently worn down some of the caution. "I missed coming by," he said. The words were so plainly said in that plain voice of his that there was nowhere for the statement to go except directly into her chest. "I noticed," she said, and watched something in his face ease at that. "Could I come in?" he asked. "You could have asked that from the beginning," she said, opening the fence gate. He came in. She made coffee and they sat at her table, and he was quiet for a while in the way of someone who has been too busy for their own thoughts and is catching up with them now that there is space. She let him be quiet. She made another pot of coffee and brought out the last of an apple cake she'd baked on Friday, and she sat across from him and had some of both and waited. "Lucy," he said finally. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. His hat was on the table. His big, capable hands were wrapped around the cup in the way of someone who needs something to hold while they say what they're about to say. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the nature of this situation between us." "And what do you make of it?" she asked. He looked up at her, the gray eyes direct and serious and containing more than they usually let out. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have not wanted to be in this kind of situation again, and that I have been telling myself that for 5 months, and that the telling has not been working particularly well." She was very still, watching him. "I am 40 years old," he said. "I am not a comfortable man. I am not easy company, and I know it, and I have largely made my peace with it. I have worked this land for 11 years alone, and I know how to do that." He paused. "And I do not want to do it alone anymore, and that is something I did not expect to know, and I am telling you because I think you deserve the truth of it rather than any other approach." There was a long silence. The October wind was coming up outside, moving through the cottonwood leaves. "Monroe," she said. He waited. "I moved to this land in April because I had nowhere else that was mine," she said. "I came here alone because I believed in what my father believed in, and because I needed to make something real with my own hands. That is still true." She looked at him steadily. "And I have been sitting across from you every time you come here thinking that I am a complete fool for feeling the way I feel, and then I go ahead and feel it anyway." Something happened in his face. Something profound and quiet, like a door opening in a house that has been shut up for years. "What way do you feel?" he asked. "Like you are the most worthwhile person I have met in the whole of my life," she said. "Like I would very much like to keep meeting you for the rest of it." Monroe Mercer sat across from her at her small kitchen table in her small house on the Kansas prairie in the October of 1878, and he looked at her with those steady, storm-gray eyes, and what moved through his expression was so complete and so genuine that she felt it in the way you feel a change in weather, felt it in her chest and her throat and the backs of her hands. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was warm. It was very steady. It was the hand of a man who knew how to stay. "I would like that too," he said. They were not impulsive people. They did not throw themselves into things without thought, and the weeks that followed were careful and deliberate in the way of two people who understand that the thing they are beginning matters enough to be done properly. Monroe came to her property 3 times a week, sometimes more. She went to the Double M on 2 occasions, seeing for the first time the scope of what 11 years of determined work looked like. The long ranch house he had built and added to over the years, the cattle operation with its barns and paddocks, and the constant purposeful activity of a crew that had been together long enough to work without much discussion. She met his crew, and she met his cook, a formidable woman named Me who had been with the Double M for 6 years and who assessed Lucy with the focused efficiency of someone taking inventory, and then apparently decided in Lucy's favor because she produced a remarkable dinner on Lucy's second visit and asked her afterward if she had opinions about the kitchen garden. She did have opinions about the kitchen garden, and Me and she spent an absorbed 40 minutes discussing them. And when Monroe came to find them, he stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression on his face that she thought he probably did not know was on it, something open and wondering, like a man who has found something he had stopped looking for. They talked about everything in those weeks, about the land and what each of them planned for it, and how those plans might fit together or not. About Ruth, about Thomas, about grief, and what it teaches a person about what matters. About the school and Monroe's opinion that Caldwell needed a proper schoolhouse building, and his intent to propose to the town council that one be funded. About cattle prices and the coming railroad expansion and what it meant for the valley's future. About books and about the Kansas sky, and about the practical realities of whether a woman's homestead claim and a man's ranching operation could be joined without either losing what made them worth having. These last conversations were the most important, and they had several of them, carefully, honestly, with the mutual directness that had been the basis of their entire relationship from the first morning. He rode onto her land and took his hat off. What emerged from those conversations was this: Lucy's land was good land, with the creek and the quality grassland and the windbreak of cottonwoods. Monroe's operation could expand beneficially to the east with access to the creek water in dry years. Lucy intended to keep teaching. Monroe thought she should. She would keep the house she had built, and it would be her house, properly, not absorbed into the Double M structure. The claims could be consolidated legally while remaining distinct in management. These were practical discussions, and they mattered, but they were not the heart of it. The heart of it was simpler and more fundamental than any of that. Monroe asked her to marry him on an evening in late October, standing on the porch of her house in the first cold of the Kansas fall, with the stars above the prairie enormous and close, and the creek making its constant quiet sound in the darkness below the cottonwoods. He had his hat in his hands. He had been talking about the winter water plan for the creek, and then he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her and said, "Lucy, will you marry me?" Not a question, not quite. The way he said most things of importance as a statement of what was true and what he needed acknowledged. She turned to face him fully. She could see his face in the starlight, open in the way it only was with her, unguarded, everything held in place, put down. "Yes," she said. "Monroe, yes." He moved before she finished saying it, closing the distance between them in one step, and he kissed her with the same directness and warmth and absolute certainty that characterized everything he did. And she kissed him back with everything she had been carefully holding since the first time she watched him ride west in the dark. And the Kansas night expanded around them like it always did, enormous and lit with stars, and entirely indifferent to individual human significance, which somehow made the two of them standing on that small porch feel more precious, rather than less. They married in the Caldwell Church in the 3rd week of November, 1878, on a day that was cold and bright and smelled of snow about to happen. Etta Sorensen stood as Lucy's witness and wept copiously, which she maintained afterward was entirely due to the temperature. Monroe's foreman Webb stood as his witness with the dignified composure of a man who had been hoping for this outcome for about 4 months. Me, the cook, organized the wedding supper with the thoroughness of someone running a military campaign. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, which was all of Caldwell and the Valley who could make it on a November weekday. Monroe wore his good dark hat and a suit coat that had clearly been carefully preserved and very recently brushed, and he stood at the front of the church with his hat in his hands and watched Lucy walk down the aisle with an expression on his face that every person in that church saw and that several of them talked about for years afterward. It was the expression of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to want, being given it anyway, by a force more generous than his own expectation. Lucy wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had ordered in October, not a traditional white, because she was a practical woman and white wool in Kansas was a commitment to problems she didn't need, and the blue suited her better anyway, brought out the warm depth of her eyes. She had flowers from Me's kitchen garden, dried carefully through the fall, worked into something that looked like it belonged. She said her vows to Monroe Mercer looking directly at him in the way she always did, and he said his to her in that low, unhurried voice that meant exactly what it said. And when the minister pronounced them, married Monroe put his hat back on and then immediately took it off again when she began to speak, when she said his name, just his name, and the laugh that came from the 30 assembled people was warm and real and full of affection. They went home to her house on the creek that evening, the house she had built, and Monroe brought 2 things from the Double M, a quilt that had been Ruth's, which he gave to Lucy with a simplicity and trust that made her hold it for a long moment before she set it carefully in the chest at the foot of the bed, and a small wooden box that had been his mother's, which he put on the shelf beside her books. She looked at the box next to her books and at him, and he looked back at her in the firelight of her house, their house, and she went to him, and they stood together in the warm middle of it all, the fire and the winter outside and the prairie night and the creek running beneath the ice beginning to form at its edges. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a long one, as Kansas winters are, but it was not a hard one in the way of some years, and they made it their own in the manner of people learning to share a life. Monroe divided his time between the Double M and the house on the creek, managing the winter ranch work from both ends. Lucy continued teaching through the winter session, which Caldwell had voted to extend in the fall, and she organized the house with the same methodical practicality she brought to everything, making it work for 2 people with the careful attention of someone who understood that comfort was not luxury but infrastructure. They argued occasionally, because they were both people with strong views and the mutual respect to express them, but their arguments had a particular quality to them. They were honest, they stayed on the actual subject, and they ended. Monroe had a way of going very quiet when he was working through something he disagreed with, which Lucy initially found maddening because it looked identical to the way he went quiet when he was simply thinking, and she could not tell which it was. She eventually learned to ask directly, and he eventually learned to indicate which quiet it was, and the adjustment took about 3 weeks and was the kind of specific, particular learning that makes a marriage. She loved the way he moved through the house. With the same economy and efficiency he brought to everything physical, not taking up more space than he needed, but filling the space he inhabited completely. She loved his hands, the precise and careful way they did delicate things despite their size, the way he could mend a bridle buckle with the same focused attention he gave to checking the foundation corners of her house. She loved his laugh, which was rare but not absent, quiet and genuine, emerging from somewhere deep. She learned over those winter months, the sound of her thinking aloud. He never said so directly, but she could feel it in the way he listened, actively, genuinely, when she was working through a problem verbally, which was how she processed difficult things. He asked questions that were never empty, always going somewhere specific, finding a gap in her reasoning or a possibility she had not considered. He loved her stubbornness, which he called her reliability, which she found was a more accurate word for it in the context of someone who trusted her with the full weight of it. In the spring of 1879, something changed at the school that changed other things in sequence. The state of Kansas was expanding its education requirements, and the position in Caldwell was reclassified to a full-year appointment at an increased salary, $22 a month. The school board offered it to Lucy formally, with a letter and a meeting with Aldred Poole, who had by then developed a genuine respect for what she had done with the school. She discussed it with Monroe at length. He listened with his hands around a coffee cup and his eyes on her face, and at the end of it he said, "It's what you're good at. Of course you should take it." "You're sure," she said. "The double M can manage without me being in two places at once in the spring," he said. "And I want you to do work that means something to you." "All my work means something to me," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I married you." She took the position. The spring of 1879 also brought the resolution of a question she had been carrying quietly since February, which was whether she was pregnant. And the answer, confirmed by the Caldwell doctor in March, was yes. She told Monroe on a Sunday morning when he came to the house from the Double M, arriving as he often did at first light, before the work of the day had begun, the time they had made into their own. She told him simply, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup warm in both hands, and she watched his face. What happened to Monroe Mercer's face in that moment was something she kept carefully in the private treasury of her most important memories for the rest of her life. He set down his coffee cup very precisely on the table. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her with a thoroughness and tenderness that was entirely unlike his usual careful restraint, and he held her for a long time without saying anything, and when he did speak his voice was different than she had ever heard it, something in it stripped down to its foundations. "Lucy," he said, just her name. "I know," she said. He pulled back and looked at her, his hands on her face, those steady hands, and his eyes were very bright. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly well," she said. "The doctor says everything is as it should be." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then kept his forehead against hers for a moment with his eyes closed. "A baby," he said, with a quietness that held about 40 different things in it. "In October," she said. He opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that she would have called wonder if she had been asked to name it. "October," he said. She put her hands over his where they held her face. "Are you all right?" "I am very far past all right," he said. And then, because he was Monroe, he sat down and began, methodically, to think through all the practical preparations that would need to be made, which she let him do, because she understood that this was how he held joy, by building something for it to live in. The summer of 1879 was the best of Lucy's life to that point, which surprised her somewhat, because it was also the most physically demanding summer she had experienced. The pregnancy progressed well and she worked through it, teaching until the end of the summer session in August and managing the house and the kitchen garden and the small flock of chickens she had acquired in May, moving a little more slowly as the months progressed but not stopping. Monroe was, throughout this period, the most attentive and least suffocating person she could have imagined. He did not treat her as an invalid. He did not make decisions for her or hover over her in a way that made her feel managed. He watched, with the same careful attention he always had, and he was there when she needed something and unobtrusive when she didn't, and he seemed to know, with a reliable accuracy that she had given up being astonished by, which was which. He moved permanently to the house on the creek in July. They had talked about it and it made sense. The house was hers and she had made it home, and Monroe found that he could manage the Double M operation from either location as long as Webb remained in charge of the day-to-day, which Webb was more than capable of. The transition was handled with the practical efficiency they brought to most things, and by August Monroe's books were on the shelf beside hers, and his saddle gear was in the small barn she had put up in the spring, and his presence in the house was as complete and natural as if he had always been there. He finished reading Emerson in August and told her that he thought the man had a great many words for a relatively straightforward set of ideas. She laughed so hard she had to sit down, which was his favorite of her laughs because it was entirely unguarded. The baby came in October as promised, on a Friday night during a thunderstorm that rolled across the Kansas plains with spectacular intensity, lightning running from horizon to horizon in great illuminated sheets, while the thunder moved through the ground like a living thing. Etta Sorensen had come to stay at the house that week, as Lucy had asked her to, and it was Etta who was in the room with her through the labor and the doctor who arrived from Caldwell, just barely in time. Monroe spent the hours of labor in the kitchen, which was as close as the doctor allowed him. Lucy could hear him, at intervals, pacing. She had never heard Monroe pace before. It was the only sign she had in all the months of the pregnancy that he was genuinely afraid of something, and she found it, through the much more demanding immediate business of the labor, entirely endearing. The baby arrived at 2 in the morning during the loudest part of the thunderstorm with a great deal of energy and a very clear opinion about the world it had entered. It was a boy, 7 pounds, healthy, furious about the cold outside the womb. Etta came to the kitchen doorway and said, "Monroe, come in." He came in. He sat on the edge of the bed beside Lucy, who was exhausted beyond anything she had previously experienced, and also more completely happy than she had words for. He looked at the baby in her arms, this small, red, outraged person who had quieted to occasional indignant sounds as Lucy held him. Monroe looked at him for a long time without speaking. His hands were very still in his lap. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, and the way he said it, the enormous tenderness of it, made Lucy close her eyes for a moment because the feeling was too large for her face. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Monroe looked at her. He had not cried. Monroe was not a man who cried easily. But his eyes were very bright in the lamplit room, and the thunderstorm outside was quieting now, moving east across the prairie, and the rain that followed was soft and steady on the roof of the house they had built together. "Thomas," Monroe said, "for your father." She looked at him. He looked back at her with everything he had, all of it, without any of the careful guarding that had been his habit for so many years. "Thomas Monroe Mercer," she said. "If you like that," he said. "I like that very much," she said. He put his hand gently over the baby's head, those large, sure hands, and the baby made a small sound and turned his head in the way of newborns, seeking warmth, finding it. The years after Thomas was born had a quality of fullness to them that Lucy had not expected, not abundance in the material sense, though the double M continued to prosper, and the combined land gave them more than they strictly needed, but a richness of texture, of specific and unrepeatable daily life that she found herself paying close attention to. Thomas grew into a child of particular energy and curiosity, with Monroe's gray eyes and Lucy's dark hair, and a temperament that combined his mother's analytical directness with his father's settled, unflappable calm in a way that produced, at age 3, a child who could sit quietly for 40 minutes examining a grasshopper, and then ask a question about it that stumped both of his parents. Monroe was, as a father, everything she had quietly believed he would be: patient, present, genuinely interested in who this small person was becoming, and possessed of an instinctive understanding of when to let Thomas figure something out on his own and when to step in. Etta Sorensen came to call on a Tuesday in the spring of 1881 and found Lucy in the kitchen garden with Thomas on her hip and a letter in her other hand that had come from the state education office in Topeka, and Etta correctly identified the expression on Lucy's face as the one that meant she was thinking hard about something that mattered. "What's in the letter?" Etta asked, setting her basket on the garden fence post. "An offer," Lucy said. "They're establishing a normal school program for teacher training in Caldwell. The state wants to appoint a supervising instructor." She paused. "They have offered the position to me." "Lord," said Etta, "What does Monroe say?" "I haven't told him yet," Lucy said. "I wanted to think it through first." This, Etta had learned, was Lucy's way. Think it through herself, arrive at her own position, then discuss it with Monroe from a place of knowing her own mind. Etta had observed over the years that this was a remarkably effective way to conduct a marriage, because neither person was waiting for the other to tell them what to think. Monroe, when she told him that evening over supper with Thomas conducting independent research into his plate of beans, listened to the offer carefully and then was quiet for his customary thinking period. "It's more work," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. "And you want to do it." "I want to think about whether I want to do it," she said precisely. He looked at her. A corner of his mouth just barely moved. "That's what you're doing right now." "Yes." "What does your thinking tell you?" She looked at Thomas, who had achieved something architecturally interesting with his beans and was examining it with satisfaction. She looked at Monroe. The lines in his face deepened by 3 years of Kansas weather and the sustained labor of a man who worked his own land, the gray in his hair more pronounced now, the steadiness of him unchanged. "It tells me," she said slowly, "that training teachers is the kind of work that multiplies itself. That every person I teach to teach well is 20 years of students who learn better." Monroe nodded once. "Then it seems like the answer is yes," he said. "You are sure about the extra demands on my time?" He looked at her steadily. "You have been making time for everything you care about since before I knew you. I'm not worried." She took the position. The second child, a daughter, arrived in the summer of 1882, 3 years after Thomas, born in the same house on the same creek bed, with the same attentive Etta Sorensen present and the same Monroe Mercer in the kitchen, though this time he did not pace, only sat at the table with his coffee and Thomas asleep in his lap, and a composure that was deeper than the first time, seasoned by knowing how this went and trusting it. They named her Ruth Anna Mercer. Ruth for the woman Monroe had loved before, Anna for Lucy's mother, and the naming of her felt like exactly the right acknowledgement of everything that had come before them. Ruth grew up with Thomas's gray eyes and Monroe's stubborn constitution, and Lucy's tendency to say exactly what she observed, often at the most interesting possible moment. She was talking in full sentences at 18 months and arguing in complete paragraphs by 3, and Monroe, watching his daughter hold court in the kitchen one Saturday morning at age 4, while simultaneously instructing Thomas, now 7, on the correct method for making biscuits, had an expression on his face that was pure, unguarded delight. Lucy, coming in from the garden to find this scene, stopped in the doorway and looked at the 3 of them, her husband and her children in the warm morning light of her house, the house she had built on the land her father had believed in, and felt the specific weight of a life that had turned out to be exactly as large as she had needed it to be. Monroe looked up and saw her in the doorway, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 5 years, with everything he had, with nothing held back, and he took off the hat he was wearing and held it against his chest. She laughed. She always laughed when he did that. After 5 years of marriage, it still undid her in exactly the way it had undone her the first time. "Is that a habit you intend to maintain indefinitely?" she asked. "You're speaking," he said. It seemed appropriate. Thomas looked between his parents with the expression of a child who has registered that something is happening that adults understand and he does not yet. "Papa always takes his hat off when Mama talks," he informed Ruth, with the authority of a 7-year-old explaining the world. "I know," said Ruth, who was 4 and had never found this surprising in the least because it was simply how the world worked as far as she knew. The normal school program became one of the more significant educational developments in Sumner County over the following years. Lucy worked at it with the systematic, long-view commitment she brought to everything she found worthwhile, and by 1885 she had trained 14 teachers who were working in rural schools across 3 counties. She kept the school in Caldwell going simultaneously, handing it off gradually to the teachers she trained, while keeping oversight of the curriculum through the county school board. Monroe, during these years, expanded the Double M eastward with the incorporation of Lucy's claim into the full operation, the creek water having proved exactly as valuable as he had anticipated for the dry years of 1881 and 1884. He employed 30 hands at peak season and was known in Sumner County as what he had always been, a man of strict fairness and unusual competence, though the town's understanding of him had softened considerably since his marriage. Several people who had previously described him to newcomers as rough as cut sandstone had revised this description to something more nuanced, which Monroe found mildly entertaining and Lucy found entirely accurate, because it had never been the wrong description of his surface, only an incomplete one. On a Saturday in the fall of 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Ruth was 3, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were doing what cottonwood trees do in October, turning gold and dropping their leaves in slow drifts that moved on the water like small boats, Monroe came to find Lucy where she was sitting on the porch of the house with a cup of coffee, and the particular expression she got when she was not doing anything and allowing herself to simply be. He sat down beside her. He took off his hat and set it on the porch rail. She looked at him. He looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the great Kansas sky above them, pale blue and enormous, stretching in every direction like something that had made its peace with infinity. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That morning in April of '78, he said, "when I rode onto your land and you were carrying water buckets and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your attention." She smiled. "And what conclusion did I reach?" "I was never entirely sure," he said, "which is partly why I kept coming back." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the creek and the grassland and the Kansas afternoon. "I concluded," she said, "that you were probably worth knowing. I subsequently revised that to absolutely worth knowing." Monroe turned his head and looked at her, and in his face she saw everything that had accumulated between them over 7 years, the patience and the warmth and the steady, faithful attention, the humor that lived under the seriousness, the depth of a man who had loved and lost and found his way to the capacity to love again. "Lucy," he said. "Monroe," she said. "I want to tell you something. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those gray eyes, those precise and honest eyes. "You are the best thing that has happened in my life," he said. "I know that is not an eloquent thing to say, but I want you to know that I know it." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come onto her land with his hat in his hand and his directness intact, and his enormous, unannounced capacity for love still present underneath all the years of solitude, waiting like a prairie spring to be found by the right water. She reached over and put her hand in his. "Monroe Mercer," she said, "you are the most eloquent man I have ever known." He made the small sound that was his laugh, the one she loved, and his hand closed around hers with its customary certainty. They sat together on the porch of her house in the October afternoon, and the cottonwoods dropped their golden leaves into the creek, and the mockingbird in the branches above them ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs, and the vast Kansas sky held them in its indifferent, generous light, and the land that had belonged to Thomas Chandler, and then to Lucy Chandler, and then to them together, stretched in every direction with the permanent, unsentimental promise of good ground that has been faithfully worked. From inside the house came the sound of Thomas telling Ruth something complicated about grasshoppers, and Ruth telling Thomas that he was wrong about it, and then the two of them arguing amiably in the way of children who love each other and have no intention of stopping, and Monroe looked at the door, and then at Lucy with an expression that contained every single thing she had ever needed to know about him. He was holding her hand. His hat was on the rail. The Kansas afternoon went long and golden around them, and the creek ran clear and cold beneath the cottonwoods, and nothing was unresolved, nothing was unfinished, nothing remained unsaid between them that needed saying. This was it. This was the whole of it. The land and the house and the creek and the children inside arguing about grasshoppers, and the man beside her, who had ridden onto her property one April morning in 1878 and taken off his hat and looked at her as though she were worth the full attention of a person's posture, and who had not stopped looking at her that way since. Lucy Chandler, who had come to Kansas alone with one trunk and a worn leather satchel and a stubborn belief in the value of open country and honest work, had made exactly the life she had come here to make. She tightened her hand in Monroe's. He tightened his in return. The mockingbird sang on.